The Siege of Krishnapur, Part 1. Anyone who has never before visited Krishnapur and who approaches from the east is likely to think he has reached the end of his journey, a few miles sooner than he expected. While still some distance from Krishnapur, he begins to ascend a shallow ridge. From here, he will see what appears to be a town in the heat distorted distance. He will see the white glitter of walls and roofs and a handsome grove of trees, perhaps even the dome of what might be a temple. Round about, there will be the unending plain still, exactly as it has been for many miles back, a dreary ocean of bald earth, in the immensity of which an occasional field of sugarcane or mustard is utterly lost. The surprising thing is that this plain is not quite deserted, as one might expect. As he crosses it towards the white walls, in the distance, the traveler may notice an occasional figure way out somewhere between the road and the horizon. A man walking with a burden on his head in one direction or another, even though, at least to the eye of a stranger, within the limit of the horizon, there does not appear to be anywhere worth walking to, unless perhaps to that distant town he has spotted. One part looks quite as good as another, but if you look closely and shield your eyes from the glare, you will make out tiny villages here and there, difficult to see because they are made of the same mud as the plain they came from. And no doubt they melt back into it again during the rainy season. For there is no lime in these parts, no clay or shale that you can burn into bricks, no substance hard enough to resist the seasons over the years. Sometimes the villages crouches in a grove of bamboos and possess a frightful pond with a water buffalo or two. More often, there is just a well to be worked from dawn till dusk by the same two men and two bullocks every single day in their lives. But whether there is a pond or not hardly matters to a traveler. In either case, there is no comfort here, nothing that a European might recognize as civilization. All the more reason for him to press on, therefore, towards those distant white walls, which are clearly made of bricks. Bricks are undoubtedly an essential ingredient of civilization. One gets nowhere at all without them. But as he approaches, he will see that this supposed town is utterly deserted. It is merely a melancholy cluster of white domes and plains, surrounded by a few trees. There are no people to be seen. Everything lies perfectly still. Nearer again, of course, he will see that it is not a town at all, but one of those ancient cemeteries that are called cities of the silent, which one occasionally come across in northern India. Perhaps a rare traveler will turn off the road to rest in the shade of a mango grove, which separates the white tombs from a dilapidated mosque. Sometimes one may find incense left smoldering in an earthenware saucer by an unseen hand, but otherwise there is no life here. Even the rustling leaves have a dead sound. Krishnapur itself had once been the center of civil administration for a large district. At that time, European bungalows had been built there on a lavish scale, even small palaces standing in grounds of several acres to house the company representatives of the day, who lived in magnificent style and sometimes even in imitation of the native princess, kept tigers and mistresses, and heaven knows what else. But then the importance of Krishnapur declined, and these magnificent officials moved elsewhere. Their splendid bungalows were left shuttered and empty. Their gardens ran wild during the rainy season and for the rest of the year dried up into deserts, over whose baked earth whirlwinds of dust glided back and forth like ghostly dancers. Now, with the creaking of loose shutters and sighing of the wind in the tall grass, the cantonment has the air of a place you might see in a melancholy dream. A visitor might well find himself reminded of the city of silence he had passed on his way to Krishnapur. The first sign of trouble at Krishnapur came with a mysterious distribution of chapatis, made of coarse flour and about the size and thickness of a biscuit, towards the end of February 1857. They swept the countryside like an epidemic. One evening, in the room he used as a study, the collector, Mr. Hopkins, opened a dispatch box and instead of the documents he had expected, found four chapatis. After a few moments, surprise and annoyance, he called the Khansama, an elderly man who had been in his service for several years and whom he trusted. He showed him the open dispatch box and the chapatis inside. The Khansama's normally impassive face displayed shock. He was clearly no less taken aback than the collector himself. He stared at the purple dispatch box for some moments before picking the chapatis out of it respectfully, as if the box had a personal dignity of its own that might have been offended. The collector, with a frown, gestured to him to remove the wretched things. A little later, he overheard the Khansama shouting at the bearers, evidently convinced that they were responsible for a reckless practical joke. The collector was busy at that time. In addition to his official duties, which had been swollen and complicated by the illness of the joint magistrate, he had a number of domestic matters on his mind. His wife, too, had been in poor health for the past few months and must now be sent home before the hot weather. It is unlikely, given his other preoccupations, that the collector would even have noticed the second pile of chapatis had his eye not been led towards them by a column of ants. The ants were issuing from a crevice between two flagstones, and their thin column passed within a few inches of his shoes on its way to the chapatis. The chapatis had a grimy and scorched appearance. Again, there were four of them, and they had been left on the top step of the brick portico which provided the main entrance to the residency. The collector had stepped out on the portico for a breath of air. He hesitated for a moment on the point of calling the Khansama again, but then he noticed the sweeper working not far away. He watched for a while as the man progressed, sitting on his heels and sweeping rather indiscriminately, with a bundle of twigs as a broom. No doubt the chapatis on the portico were the property of the sweeper. The collector went inside again, dismissing the matter from his mind. The following afternoon, however, he found four more chapatis. This time they were not in his study, but on the desk in his office, neatly arranged beside some papers. Though there were still nothing very menacing about them. As soon as he saw them, he knew beyond doubt that there was going to be trouble. He examined them carefully, but this told him nothing, except that they were rather dirty. The collector was a large and handsome man. He wore low side whiskers, which he kept carefully trimmed, but with nevertheless sprouted out stiffly like the ruff of a cat. He dressed fastidiously. The high collars which he habitually wore were sufficiently unusual in a country station like Krishnapur to make a deep impression on all who saw him. He was a man of considerable dignity too, with a keen but erratic sense of social proprieties. Not surprisingly, he was held in awe by the European community. No doubt this was partly because they could not see his faults very clearly. In private, he was inclined to be moody and overbearing with his family, and sometimes careless over matters which others might regard as of great importance. For example, although he had seven children and was living in a country of high mortality for Europeans, he had not yet brought himself to make up will, an unfortunate lapse of his usually powerful sense of duty. At that moment, he happened to be alone in the office, one of a number of rooms in a part of the residency set aside for government business. He was not fond of this room. Its bleak official aspect displeased him, and usually he preferred to work in his study, situated in a more domestic part of the building. The office contained only a few overloaded shelves, a couple of wooden chairs for those rare visitors whose rank entitled them to be seated in his presence, and his own desk, untidily strewn with papers and dispatch boxes. The person who had placed the offending chapatis on it had had to clear a space for them. On one of the lateral walls was a portrait of the young queen with rather bulging blue eyes and a vigorous appearance. Disturbed and having now forgotten the reason he had gone to his office in the first place, he made his way slowly back towards the hall of the residency, wondering whether certain measures might be taken to palliate the effects of this approaching but still hypothetical trouble, or even to avoid it altogether. Just supposing that serious trouble should break out in Krishnapur, an insurrection, for instance, where could we find shelter? Could the residency, merely as a matter of interest, of course, be defended? As he stood in the hall, pondering this question, the collector experienced the sensation of coolness and great tranquillity. During the daytime, the light here came from a great distance. It came between the low arches of veranda, across cool flagstones, through the green louvered window known as Jill Mills, let into the immensely thick walls, and at last, in the form of a pleasant reflected twilight, to where he was standing. One felt very safe here. The walls, which were built of enormous number of the pink wafer like bricks of British India, were so very thick you could see yourself how thick they were. The residency was more or less in the shape of a church. That is, if you can imagine a church which one entered by stepping over the altar, the transept as you stand on the altar looking in was formed. by, on the left, a library well furnished with everything but books, of which there was only a meagre supply, some having been borrowed and not returned, some eaten by the ubiquitous ants, and some having simply vanished nobody knew where. Yet others, imprisoned, glumly pressed their spines against the glass of cabinets whose keys had been lost. And on the right, a drawing room, lofty, spacious, and gracious. Immediately facing you in the nave was a magnificent marble staircase, a relic of the important days of Krishnapur, when things were still done properly. Behind the staircase, the dining room, together with a number of other rooms, having to do in some way with eating or with European servants or with children, ran along the rest of the nave, which was flanked on each side by deep verandas. The building was of two stories, if you discount the twin towers which rose somewhat higher. From one of these towers, the Union Jack fluttered from dawn till dusk. On the other, the collector sometimes set up a telescope when the mood took him to scrutinize the heavens. The collector, whose mind had returned to browse on chapatis, gave a start as a man's voice issued loudly from the open door of the drawing room nearby. The mind is furnished, declared the voice in a tone which did not invite debate, with a vast apparatus of mental organs for enabling it to manifest its energies. Thus, when aided by optical and auditory nerves, the mind sees and hears. When assisted by an organ of consciousness, it feels by an fear. Organ of casuality, it reasons. What nonsense, muttered the collector, who had recognized the voice as belonging to the magistrate and had now remembered that he himself should be sitting in the drawing room at this moment, for the fortnightly meeting of the Krishnapur Poetry Society was due to begin, indeed had already begun, since the magistrate was holding forth, though not apparently about poetry. Dr. Gall of Vienna, who discovered this remarkable science, happened to notice, while still at school, that those of his fellow students who were good at learning by heart tended to have bulging eyes. By degrees, he also found external characteristics which indicated a disposition for painting, music, and the mechanical arts. I really must go in, thought the collector, and reflecting that after all, as president of the society, it was his duty. He took a few firm steps towards the door, but again he hesitated, this time standing in the open doorway itself. From here he could see a dozen ladies of the cantonment sitting apprehensively on chairs facing the magistrate. Many of these ladies held sheaves of paper densely covered with verse of their own devising, and it was the sight of all this verse which had caused the collector to hesitate involuntarily at the very last moment. Behind the ladies, his four older children, aged from 4 to 16, all girls, the two boys were at school in London, sat in a despairing row. They took no part in these proceedings, but he considered it healthy to expose them to artistic endeavor. Only the youngest, still a baby, was excused attendance. Unaware that the president of their society was lingering at the door, the ladies stared at the magistrate as if hypnotized. But very likely they did not hear a single word he said. They will be in far too great anxiety as to the fate of their verses to listen to him discoursing on phrenology, a subject in which only he found any interest. Soon the moment will come when they will read their works, and the magistrate will pronounce sentence on them, a moment which they both desired and dreaded. The collector, however, only dreaded it. This was not because of the low standard of the verse, but because the magistrate's judgments were invariably pitiless, and even at times when he became excited, verged on the insulting, while the ladies put up with it and still returned week after week for their poems to be subjected to such indignities was more than the collector could fathom. Yet it was the collector himself who was responsible for this fortnightly tournament, since it was he who had founded the society. He had done so partly because he was a believer in the ennobling powers of literature, and partly because he was sorry for the ladies of the cantonment who had, particularly during the hot season, so little to occupy them. At first he had been pleased with the ladies' enthusiasm and had considered the plan a success, but then he had made the mistake of inviting Tom Willoughby, the magistrate. The magistrate suffered from the disability of a free thinking turn of mind and from a life that was barren and dreary to match. To make things worse, he was married, but in the celibate manner of so many English civilians. The collector had eyed the magistrate's marriage with complaisant pity, His wife, imported from England, had stayed 2 or 3 years in India until driven down home by the heat. The boredom and fortuitous pregnancy. The collector had witnessed this sad story so often during his time in India, and now, too, later than most, it seemed that his own marriage, which had survived so long in this arduous climate, must suffer a similar fate. For his wife, Caroline, sitting nervously in the front row with her own sheaf of poems, will soon be sailing from Calcutta. Such was the reward for complacency, he reflected, not without a certain stern satisfaction at the justice of this retribution. Oh, there is Mr. Hopkins, says the magistrate, ending his discourse abruptly as he caught sight of the collector lurking in the doorway. And the collector was obliged to step forward, smiling as if in anticipation of the poetry that will soon be gratifying his ears. An empty chair had been placed beside the magistrate, who was somewhat younger than the collector, and had the red hair and ginger whiskers of the born atheist. His fact wore a constant expression of cynical surprise, one eyebrow raised and the corner of his mouth compressed, as far as one could make out beneath the growth of whiskers, which here varied from ginger to cinnamon. It was said in the cantonment that he even slept with one eyebrow raised. The collector did not know if there was any truth in this. At one time, everyone had sat in a circle, and every member of the society had been willing to voice an opinion on the poem which had just been read. Those were the days when every single poem had bristled with good qualities like a hedgehog and had glutted itself with praise like a jackal. The happy days before the magistrate had been invited. Soon after his arrival, the circle had begun to disintegrate. The ladies had progressively dropped away from each side of him until soon they faced him in a semicircle, and now at last directly as if in the dock. The collector had bravely installed himself at the magistrate's side in order to plead mitigating circumstances. By this time, the poetry reading had begun, and Mrs. Worsley, wife of one of the railway engineers, had faltered to the end of a sonnet about an Earl King. Everyone, including the collector, was now watching the magistrate in dismay, waiting for his verdict. Although sure about most things, the collector lacked confidence in his own judgment when it came to poetry, and was obliged to defer to the magistrate, but not without the private suspicion that his own judgment might be superior after all.